much. And we are going to talk about intensities. So
I am sitting because I need a knee replacement, which I refuse to go do because I don't have time. It's not that I worry about surgery. I hope you're not taking this, but you probably will. Anyway, so that's why I'm leaning here, if you don't mind. How many of you, since you are knowledgeable about gifted kids, or you are a gifted child yourself, how many of you are knowledgeable about intensities? Really, no. Oh, good. Then that means I'm sharing new information, because I'm always concerned about sharing with, I love sharing with parents because they're always hungry for information. But I'm always worried about ODing teachers with, yeah, I already know that. So this is good. That means that this is an area for you that's a little different. So what we're going to do is look at 3 things. First of all, something called Dabrowski's overexcitabilities, which is where the intensity concept comes from. I'll tell you just briefly about that. Then we'll talk about intensity in gifted children, and then I'm going to suggest some intervention strategies for classroom teachers. And tonight I'll be sharing the same front information, but sharing strategies for parents in terms of dealing with intensities. Now, I know that you've seen it. You know when you see intensity, but what's it really all about? Well, this Polish psychologist by the name of, I won't even attempt his first name, but his last name is Dabrowski, and you've probably heard of Dabrowski before. He developed, he did a lot of observations of gifted individuals, children and adults, and he developed a concept that has, or kind of a theory that has 2 concepts. One he calls developmental potential, and that means your initial opportunity for growth. In other words, innately what you have and how you could grow, you know, how your brain is structured and your enzymes and everything else. What potential do you have from that? And then how is it actualized? If you are a child in poverty but have that potential, it may not be actualized as would a child in Granite Bay, for example, with all the opportunities of early environment and language and everything else. So that was one part to his theory, and then the other part was what he called multi-levelness. And that means that we have various levels of inner growth. And inner growth he talked about as being something really important for an individual being self-actualized. And you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization. Well, they kind of go hand in hand with those concepts. And he said it might be higher in a young person who has been self-integrated. In other words, a young person who can early have the opportunity to learn how to be metacognitive, how to think on their own, how to take ideas and put them into action, will probably have a higher multi-levelness than the next person. But it's really the work of personal growth. This is really something that nobody can do for you. You take all the tools that are given to you and the support that you get, and then you do the self-actualization, the self-growth. And gifted people have a great potential for this self-growth. But we can't just do it in a vacuum. So we'll talk more about that later. So that's basically Dabrowski's, what he calls overexcitabilities, which the spell check has no idea what that means. So that means that's a new word for you. So now it's in my lexicon. He had 5 areas of what he called overexcitabilities: psychomotor, sensual, intellectual, imaginational, and emotional. And we're going to work mostly on emotional, but I want to share the others with you at the beginning. Psychomotor, you've seen this. This is surplus of energy, can't sit still, talks too fast, talks all the time, needs to be active, and is often, for gifted children, misdiagnosed as ADHD, way overdiagnosed. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and MDs, pediatricians, don't know a lot about gifted kids. In fact, trying to help people find a psychologist to do any testing for someone who wants to do it on the outside is almost impossible, because they just don't, they know how to give an IQ test and they can interpret the results to you, but they don't know how then to apply giftedness to that. What does that mean for a parent? So pediatricians way over misdiagnose ADHD. And there's a wonderful book by Dr. James Webb, who is a wonderful psychologist out of Arizona. I know him well. And his book, Misdiagnosis, is exactly about gifted kids being misdiagnosed as Asperger's, as autistic, as ADHD. So it's a huge, huge area of concern. This is the kid that never sits still. You know them. I was that kid. Got my name on the board every week for talking. You probably didn't have any of those problems as a GATE child, did you? No, but she was. The sensual.
Oh, I'm sure I was. I wasn't identified.
Yeah.
Right. You probably had a 131.
Yeah, that's right. You didn't quite make the 132 cutoff.
Okay, the sensual area is the child with enhanced sensual awareness or experiences, and that can be in the 5 senses: touch, taste, sound. These are the kids who can't stand labels in their clothes. Everything's too tight. They really would prefer to run around with nothing on. I'm not quite that far, but I can relate to the label thing. And somebody was telling me the other day about her husband wanted her to darn his socks, and she's like, "Are you kidding?" But she said, "Oh, I'm just going to do it anyway." So she took a light bulb, because she had no darning thingy, and darned the sock for him. And then when he wore them, it rubbed a blister on his foot, and he was really unhappy. So he was one of those kids that really doesn't like sewn socks. That was interesting. But this also includes those who have a tremendous appreciation for beauty or for music. Beauty as an aesthetic beauty. What a beautiful sunset. What a really sensing those things much more richly than other people do. Taste is interesting to me. I think about myself in that area. Obviously, I eat too much, because that's physically obvious for my body, or I exercise too little, I guess, at my age. But I really enjoy food for the taste of it. And I enjoy going out to eat. I've just sort of discovered this about myself lately as I've done some traveling and been to some places where I've enjoyed some foods. It's really about tasting, having a different taste of something that I'm not going to cook, or that you don't usually have at home, or that you're not going to get at Denny's. So really good taste of food. I just got back from a Mississippi riverboat cruise, and the food was absolutely fabulous, and it was mostly fish that I ate, but it was prepared so wonderfully in kind of a French, New Orleans kind of cuisine. It was so fun. My palate loved it. Intellectual is another area, and this is the child who is extremely curious, has a capacity for sustained intellectual effort. I mean, just, persistent, searching for truth and understanding. These are kids who have a tremendous interest in morality and fairness. And you probably know these kids, that it's absolutely important that things be fair, and not just for them, but for everybody. They want fairness to happen, and they don't like to see injustice. And they're also capable of reflective thought, much more than their age peers. They can really dwell on something and think about it and apply it and use that ability. Then, and by the way, in all of these, any gifted child can have any or one or combination of any of these. But usually they have 2 or 3. It's not just one that, that they're tremendously, that's their main intensity, if they are intense, and most truly gifted children. So you're creating an opportunity for your teachers to have a whole bunch of very intense kids.
So did you say most kids have 2 or 3? That's what I was going to ask.
Most have 2 or 3.
2 or 3,
yeah.
okay.
Most have 2 or 3. And to different degrees, too,
right.
Because just like giftedness, you can be brilliant at 200 IQ, or you can be, 135 and
Right.
still very bright and reflective. The interesting thing about IQ, and I was reading this the other day, is that once you reach at about 80, you really have difficulty learning. So that's the special ed level. At 100, where most people are, despite our not liking the concept of the bell curve, it's there. At 100, you're pretty capable of doing just about anything and learning. Anything past that, you can succeed in college, but once you get past 132, anything above that, there's no greater guarantee for success. And in fact, you probably know lots of, have heard of or are aware of gifted people who absolutely don't succeed at all in our world because they don't fit, or they don't deal with the famous people, the Einsteins and Walt Disney and those people of the world. So it doesn't really pay a whole lot to be really too bright, but some people are, and that's just the way they are. Then there's the imaginational area, and this is creative thinking, capacity for image and fantasy. This is the Walt Disneys, this Spielbergs, of the world. They can create, and this is also the child who will create a private world or have an imaginary friend. Many gifted children create that kind of thing, and sometimes it's often because nobody else understands them, and you don't want to talk to yourself, so you create an imaginary friend that you can then share things with that nobody else understands or tell jokes to, or just reflect with. And these are kids who have a need for novelty and variety in whatever they're doing. And then the emotional intensity is probably the one that most gifted kids have. And this is extremes of emotion. They're very empathetic, and that goes along with fairness and justice as well. Really caring about others, really being struck by homelessness, or that kind of kids that don't get to go to school, or kids in poverty, or whatever. There are also kids that are often shy and timid because that emotionality is so great that it can be overwhelming to them and overwhelming to others, and so they tend to kind of try to hold it back so that it doesn't drive everybody else nuts, which most people probably tell them. And they have a capacity for strong attachments, but often one or two. Think about the kids in your class who only have maybe one or two really close friends. They'll play with the other kids, but I was kind of that way. I kind of always just had, one really good friend. I'd go play with other kids, and I was an outdoor kid, so I was always outdoors playing with everybody, but there was always one or two special people, not tons of, good friends. Okay, so the concept of the overexcitabilities leads us to understanding more about intensities. So we have intensity of thought, and that's the mind going all the time. We have the intensity of purpose. Once you make up your mind to do something, you're going to do it. There's that kid that's going to do it whether you want them to or not. Please come to the reading circle. They're still reading the book that they took off of the shelf, and they're not coming until that book is done. And that's also persistence and perseverance. Intensity of emotion is the kids that internalize everything about themselves or about others. There's the intensity of spirit, and this is a child who thinks, goes along with the overexcitability about being very empathetic and caring. Concern. This is also the child who often asks, who is God, and does he exist, and those existential questions that most kids don't ask about. They may be aware of it if they go to church, or they certainly have heard people talk about concepts of religion, but don't really wonder about that like these kids do. And the intensity of soul, asking philosophers kinds of questions that most kids this age don't ask. Okay, so emotional intensity is in the gifted is not a matter of feeling more than other people, but a different way of experiencing the world. So you don't say that they're more emotional, they feel more than others, they just sense things in a different way. And that all connects with that, how those metabolized synaptic connections are working in those brains. There are a lot more connections, and we have, we've sort of gotten away from this left-right brain kind of concept, but we do have two sides to our brain. And gifted people cross-brain synthesize much more than others, much more than average people. They're where you might identify a place in the brain where an average person would do language or something like that. The gifted person is probably cross-modal, going on both sides. And by the way, gentlemen, I'm sorry to tell you, but women do that much more than men do. It's just, that's why you cannot talk and switch TV stations at the same time. You must focus on that clicking, and you can't talk at the same time. And I'm sorry, but that's physically the way it is. Just giving you a bad time, but it is true physically. Okay, so everything is vivid, absorbing, penetrating, encompassing. It's a way of being what, and I can't even remember who said it, a way of being quiveringly alive. I imagine just being always, just sensing things and being alive and thinking about all kinds of things. Intensities do promote some problems for gifted kids, and some of them are the emotional intensity, we talked about that, unrealistic expectations of themselves and others can lead to, the concept of perfectionism and the fact that they might be too perfectionistic, and can lead to depression. I'm supposed to say depression, but you know how the spell check changes words for you, whether you want to or not? I think that's what it did. Excessive compulsiveness can come out of this. Low frustration tolerance. They don't like to be frustrated, and they're not very tolerant of it because they're so good at so many things. And what's a real challenge for gifted children is if they don't learn early to take risks, then they are not going to. And so they will either not do something, not finish it, or not turn it in, which will frustrate you as a teacher, because why didn't you turn, okay, so you only did 3/4 of the problems. Still, that's better than nothing. But I can't turn it in if it's not perfect. So that there's that frustration and not being able to tolerate it. So that's something that needs to be taught early. They're easily hurt emotionally, and they can feel powerless to solve world problems. They're so worried about homelessness or hunger or terrorism or whatever is the latest in the news, and they feel powerless to be able to solve those problems. I think we need some of these people to replace the people that we have that are trying to do that, but I won't go there. They're often impatient because they know too much and they see too much. When they look at something, they see it in many more dimensions than the average person. So they see the usefulness of something that nobody else can see, or these are the inventors. These are the people that see, my nephew is like this. He has a whole book of Leonardo da Vinci kinds of drawings of things that he's invented in his head, and that he would like to be able to create and produce. And it's not a pipe dream, it's the way he thinks. It's the way Leonardo da Vinci thought. And of all of the things that he started, he finished very few. He only has 17 works of art, and he started millions of them. He had all kinds of inventions that never came to fruition, but he had drawings of them that we now look at and say, oh my God, he invented the helicopter. Way before anybody else did. But he wasn't persistent in finishing them. These are the kids that are disruptive, they're the class clowns, and that's a way of sort of coping with, people bug me when I'm too smart, or they harass me when I'm too smart, or they bully me you know, when I say smart things, so I'll just be the class clown instead. Imagine having Robin Williams as your student. You know, that's the class clown. Excessive questioning, why? We usually relate that to 3-year-olds, but these are kids who continue to ask that on and on and on. They go too far, they seem disruptive, and they're unable to accept help. Okay, so I think if you were here last time, I talked a little bit about a study called Brains on Fire by 2 psychologists who they did a study where they looked to see how the brains of gifted people were working with functional MRIs, and it showed intense and diffuse brains much more than the average person. So it shows that gifted people are not one-mode thinkers, and that they have that cross-modality that I talked about. And they also have enhanced distractibility, meaning they can daydream, be off in another world, but then that can also lead to great creativity, and then they can come right back. That's the kid who, you know, they're not paying attention as far as you're concerned. You ask the question and they know the answer. Well, you just said such and such, and you're thinking, how could they have known that when they're obviously staring out the window thinking about something else? But they can do that. Frustrating for teachers. But they also need time for rumination and reflection, and we don't do enough of that. We all don't do enough of that, but certainly we don't do enough of it in school, where we just give kids time to think about things. But not every kid is patient with thinking about things. So how do you set it into your day when you have other kids that, you know, are ready to move on or have a lower level of interest in whatever it is, so you have to move on. That's hard. Okay, so let's talk. The main thing I wanted to share were what are some things that you can do as teachers with these kids. Well, you're doing it now. Far too many teachers know nothing about giftedness. Principals don't, teachers don't. Did you learn anything about giftedness when you were in credential program? I didn't either. Even when I was getting my administrative credential, we had a class called Special Needs, and it was all about special ed, and there was a chapter about gifted, but she didn't have time to do it. We were going to skip it, and I said, no, we're not. I'm going to do it. So I did a little thing with it, and everybody was really happy, but we don't get, we don't get any instruction in giftedness because of all the myths where we think they're going to be okay anyway. We've got to focus on the low achieving kids. We've got to focus on, the kids that need extra help, the intervention kids. We don't have time for this. So that you need to learn about giftedness as an educator and understand intensities, so that when you see it, you can identify it and know that it's not all about drama or over exaggeration. It's who that kid is, and they can't help it. That's who they are. You have to create a learning environment that allows for movement and creativity and exploration and choice, but with structure. One thing that gifted kids absolutely need is structure, even more than average kids, because those brains are so whirring, and it's that file cabinet with the papers flying out all the time is sort of my concept of gifted kids, and you've got to help. I know I spent 10 years as a teacher of the gifted, full day, and I spent, 6th grade, and I spent probably the first 6 weeks teaching organizational skills, calendaring, keeping your things in the right place. Weekly, we had to clean desks because they were, like this, but they learned, how to get organized. They're so busy thinking about so many millions of things that they need somebody to help them, and there's no gene for organization or study skills or writing a paper or anything else like that. And it's far too often we just tell them, well, just go learn about something you're interested in and let me know when you're done. Well, they don't know how to start that project. Just because the mind is good doesn't mean that they have those skills. So anything that you don't already know how to do, you do have to be taught, and you're not born with organizational skills. I happen to be born with organizational parents, so I lucked out. But if you're not, then, you know, you as a teacher have to structure your classroom so that those skills are taught, so that they're there, and that it gives them some boundaries that they otherwise would just run amok because they don't know how to do that. And they often, you have to understand that gifted kids often gain incidental knowledge. They watch Nova, or they, you know, see something in a movie, or they go to a museum, or they just happen to read it in the paper. So they learn all kinds of stuff that you didn't teach. And that's okay. That's wonderful, but you have to take on the role of acknowledging that they do have that knowledge and you don't. And I think that's one of the things. I think today's teachers are much better at it, but I can remember as a kid, even in high school, having teachers who did not want me to say anything about anything they didn't know about. Being, you know, the bearer of all knowledge was the teacher, not me. Well, what if I happen to know about black holes and you don't? Then why can't that be acknowledged? So that's critical for teachers to do. Teachers have to understand that gifted students may know more than, oh, I just said that. Understand and value them intellectually and emotionally, but don't value them intellectually as the producer of perfect stuff. You know, the reward should be about the effort that's been put into something, not about how great it is. And we tend to, does that make sense, or you're frowning? Okay, so if I start the night before on my poster that's due, and I'm good at that, so I whip it out, and I haven't put any effort into it, I haven't really learned anything new because all I did was put down stuff I already knew. And somebody else worked 2 weeks really, really hard on theirs, and they're both equally as good. Who had the better benefit? Me, because I didn't learn anything new. I didn't put any effort in, so I didn't gain any value from my effort. The other kid worked really hard, gained a lot of effort, put in a lot of effort, and gained.
So I'm saying can put in the effort and learn new knowledge.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
You sure?
Yes.
Because you're frowning. I don't want to. I want you to.
Well, I misunderstood the first time, I guess, what you were saying. I just, you know, if someone, there's always knowledge to be gained.
Sure. Oh,
so
yes.
if someone doesn't put the effort into it and says, oh, and they just regurgitate knowledge that they've already known.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's, to me, that's not quality work.
Right.
Just because they look the same, both are good posters, or whatever the project is. You haven't really gained anything by the one that you produced because you didn't put any effort in it and you have no new knowledge.
Right.
The kid who worked hard, learned a whole bunch of new stuff, and produced something just as good, did gain.
Right.
So then your dilemma becomes, how do I grade them? And how do I know whether they put the effort in? So, you know, that becomes communication with them, rubrics that ask about effort as well as, you know, quality of work, talking to parents, that kind of thing. So I'm just saying, don't just value them as these little brainiacs that are, you know, smart. We need to help them understand that effort is extremely important, and that taking a risk to learn something new on your own without it just being incidental is also important. At the beginning of the year, I always, and you probably do this, I always did a learning style inventory and an interest inventory, and you can find those on the internet. I didn't bring any copies of any that I used to use what Joe Renzulli produced back in the 80s. It's probably still out there, but it told me how they learned so that I could vary, you know, our activities so that everybody's learning styles got met. But I also would challenge kids to use a different, that's the harder learning style. If you're really good artistically, then this time produce something that's, you know, write it. Write an essay, or, you know, do a report or something. I know that's harder for you, but that helps you grow and learn to take risks. and then also their interest. I found that in knowing what their interests were, I might have gone all year and not known that that kid absolutely loved to play piano and went home every day after school and did that, because they didn't share it with me, unless I had done an interest survey where I found out that they were really interested in music, and then I could tap into that as a way to motivate them or help them understand how they could use that to motivate themselves. There's an overexcitability questionnaire that might also be something that you could do with I think you could do it with younger kids too. You could just do it verbally, and instead of them writing, you could shape the questions so that they make sense to younger kids and have them draw some of these things. It's kind of like what psychologists do when they ask kids to, share their feelings, that kind of thing. But these questions delve into how do you into intensities, and they're related to all the different modes of sense. What are your special kind of daydreams and fantasies? When do you feel most energy, and what do you do with it? Is taste something special to you? As I said before, I never thought about why I like to go eat something at a nice restaurant. I enjoy the ambiance and the people and the wine, but I also enjoy the taste, and I never realized that that's why I like to go out. It's not to fill myself up, because you can eat and get full, but it's to enjoy the flavor, and I had no idea that that's where I was coming from until I started reading more about the overexcitabilities. And you could do this with little kids, like, where was the first one? Yeah. Do you ever feel high, ecstatic, and incredibly happy? So you could say to little kids, do you ever feel really, really, really happy? And what are you doing when you feel that way? Reminds me of that commercial where that little girl's mom's teaching her how to ride her bike, and she pushes her, and she goes, and then she turns, and then she gets out, and she's just jumping up and down and jumping up and down. She's so excited, and it just reminded me of that. She was obviously ecstatic about that accomplishment. Well, a little kid could draw a picture of that and share that. So it's just another way of tapping into kids and seeing where they're coming from, rather than just the learning abilities that they have that you deal with most of the time. So that's on that list there if you want to use it. What's another thing that's really critical for kids, and I think I mentioned it last time, but if you weren't here, it's really important to talk to gifted kids about what it means to be gifted, that it shouldn't be a big secret. The label is concerning enough to most people, and if they hear that somebody says, oh, she's gifted, like your family does to you, then you have to be able to defend, well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean I'm better. It doesn't mean I'm special. It means I think differently. I learn differently. I used to have parents come in to my office when I was a director of the GATE program in Sac City, and they'd say, how do I get my kid in GATE? And I would say, you don't understand. It's not a club. It's not even Princeton. It's the appropriate academic placement for your child and the way they learn and the way they think. If it fits, they'll qualify. If it doesn't fit, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your child and that they can't succeed, they can't go to college. It just means that they don't fit in this realm that we call gifted, that we unfortunately abhor the label of. And that's particularly true in our country because we're so democratic. We're so concerned about democracy and fairness and equality that we don't look at equity. And equity is about what do you need. Every child has the right to what we call a FAPE. It's a fair and appropriate, free and appropriate public education. The key word there is appropriate. And we don't do that for gifted kids in this country.
You know, we did have a discussion at one of our GATE advisory committees. One of the parents was worried about, we were talking about the special activities that Heidi and Patrice were designing, and it was called a GATE specialized activity, and they were going to be doing some things that were in their interest area. And one of the parents, I think you might remember, those of you on the committee, realized that, but it said GATE at the top, and she was a little bit uncomfortable about, I haven't really told my child that he is GATE, and should I? I didn't want to harm him. So we had that discussion about it at the meeting, and that was really good for that parent to really kind of be freed from that concern. So I think that would be a good thing for us to bring up tonight also.
Yes, definitely. And yeah, it's critical. And I mean, I used to share that with my GATE kids. They were, you know, they'd gotten to 6th grade, and their other teachers were also excellent teachers and had talked about it. But we talked all about how the brain works, and, you know, we went into the whole scientific background of it, and this is why you are the way you are. Doesn't mean you're better, more special, greater than somebody else. It just means you learn differently. Your wires connect in a different way. So you have needs that need to be met by instruction that meets those particular needs. As I said earlier, they need organizational skills and how to process information. And it's so critical to learn how to process information as opposed to just opening the top and dumping in more information. We have so much information available to us today with the internet, and you know, it's growing not even exponentially, but whatever the next mathematical level is. I was a math major, but I can't think what the next level would be, but exponential doesn't even describe, I think, what knowledge we gain every year now today that took us thousands of years to gain up until now. So you can't possibly pour all that information into the brain and maintain it. So what you have to learn how to do is to think and to process and to use the information to solve problems and to, you know, to think about your thinking. You probably have learned this in differentiation training, but you also have to teach them to think like a disciplinarian, like an expert in the field, and you probably do think like a disciplinarian. And it's so critical for these kids to talk about the vocabulary and the processes and the activities of particular experts in the field, because that's what they're going to go out and do. They're going to go out and process information and have to know, how does a person who's an expert in a field act? What do they do? What do they think about? How do they process information? How do they share information? So that's really critical for these kids, particularly with intensity. Teach gifted kids to be metacognitive, to understand the nature of thinking, not just think about, you know, if you just say think about it, they don't know what that means. But how do you think about your thinking? How do you think about things? How do you process information? And that might take some delving into, you know, some readings and stuff yourself and finding out, well, how do we think about our thinking? What does that mean? What exercises are there? What can somebody do? I don't have any specifics for you, but it's something to think about. Teach gifted children to evaluate the quality or status of a piece of information as knowledge. This is so important with the internet today, because you can look up anything and it'll tell you anything, and you have to be able to take that information and evaluate whether that's good information or not. I remember when the internet first came out and people were just copying hunks of it and turning it in as their papers, you know, for a college class or something, and professors saying, what is this? This is not anything. This isn't information. This isn't even true. So you have to be able to evaluate something you've read or heard, and then decide whether it's true or not, and whether you want to use that information to further yourself. So what does count as knowledge? What is knowledge? Another thing that teachers can do, particularly with older kids, is teach Socratic seminar. Do you know what Socratic seminar is? It's a process. It's a whole process that that you can go through that teaches kids how to. It's kind of like debate, but it's learning how to take an essential question and argue it, and support it and learn more about it. You learned about essential questions in differentiation, so you should know what that is. So if you take an essential question and then there's a process for learning about it, defending it, arguing it, it's kind of like debate, but in a little less formal way. And it's a great process for kids to think about thinking. When I was in, I just happened to think of this, when I was in Tibet, traveling in China and Tibet, we went to a monastery, and one of the things, and there were young monks there, and one of the things they do is they put out a question or a comment or something, and then they go, and they kind of like throw it off to the young monks who were sitting there, and then they're supposed to think of a response that's, that fits that. And they weren't speaking English, so I have no idea what they were saying. But that whole process of this, now I'm giving this to you, and now you think about it and send it back to me. And they were just, everybody all around was doing this, and it was just fascinating. What they were doing was basically a form of Socratic seminar within the Buddhist religion. So it was really interesting. You can also teach, and I did a lot of this, rather than setting up rules or saying this is the way it's going to be, we did moral dilemmas. So I would share, here's something that could happen on a playground. This is a moral dilemma. So how do we decide what's the right way to do it? Two people want the ball. So, and it could be as simple as that. But the moral dilemma is who has the right to the ball. And so then you can have a conversation about how does that set up rules about sharing or taking turns, those, developing those rules out of what are moral dilemmas, because we all run into moral dilemmas, and there's whole lists of moral dilemmas that you could present to kids. I remember one time we had, one of the kids brought it in, and this was 6th grade, and this was back in the 80s, and it was about, I think it was about abortion. And I was kind of worried about whether parents would be concerned about my 6th graders having this conversation, but there wasn't any, I think it's right and you're wrong kind of thing. It was more about presenting the two sides of the argument, and the parents actually responded very positively and said, this was great. My kid came home and said, did you know this? And I'm thinking about this, and what do you think about that? It wasn't abortion, but it was something like that that was really kind of, should we be discussing this? But I let it happen and thought I would apologize later, but it worked out okay.
What grade level?
6th. Yeah. So how do you nurture emotional intensity? Well, you have to first of all accept kids' emotions and let them know that this is who they are, that they're not being over dramatic, they're not being weird, they're being who they are, and help them understand that their emotions are their emotions. You can't try to minimize their emotion. If somebody throws themselves on the floor and has a crying fit over, something, then you can certainly learn to set limits for things like that, and sort of not ignore them, but maybe not dwell on that kind of thing. Just let it happen, and then, oh, you feel better now? Are you finished? Okay, let's move on, that kind of thing. Teach children that their feelings are normal for them, as I said. Apply consistent discipline, which we talked about, and discuss their feelings openly. Now, as teachers, you're not going to have the time to do that like the parents will, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't. If you see an emotion happening that's getting in the way of learning, or getting in the way of them dealing with other kids, or getting in the way of your instruction, then you do have to discuss it. And it may be that you discuss it in a little group, or you discuss it with them privately, but it should be discussed. And you can certainly do it in a way that you acknowledge it as who they are, but talk about are there some things that I could do to help you minimize this so that you don't feel embarrassed or the kids don't give you a bad time? What are some alternatives that you could use that would help you? I remember as almost a brand new teacher realizing that I had a kid who had ADHD before ADHD was even a thing back in the 70s, early 70s. But I knew that Richard had to move when he had to move. This was like 3rd or 4th grade. I knew that he had to move, and I also knew that he was going to drive everybody else nuts if he didn't move. So we had a clue where I just point to the door. He would run outside. I could see the track from the yard from the room, so it wasn't like he was out of sight. He would go out, run around 3 times, come back in, sit down, he was fine. So, he just kind of had a signal where he was like, I got to do this. And it wasn't that he was trying to, like the kids that want to go to the bathroom all the time, he wasn't trying to get out of anything. He just knew that he needed to do that. I knew he needed to do it. And the other kids are like, whew, thank you so much. So he wasn't getting any special deal. They didn't want to go out there and run around. So it wasn't like it wasn't fair. It was just what worked for him. You can also use expressive outlets such as art, music, poetry, journaling, blogging. Gifted kids love to blog. Any kid can set up a blog. There are plenty of free opportunities out there. I will share that with the parents tonight. When I was teaching geocaching, which I do to kids in the summer at Sac State in the Academic Talent Search Program a couple years ago in the summer before I started this job, I unretired. When I was retired, I was teaching this, and it was only a week long, but we had, but it was gifted kids, and I set up a blog so that they could then go in and do their homework on the blog and write each day about what we'd done. And they absolutely, in 1 week, absolutely went crazy with this silly blog. And these were 4th and 5th graders, so they weren't even, older kids. But they absolutely loved the idea of being able to get on there and share their thinking, share their ideas, share with each other. And then they wanted to know, could they continue it after we were done with the class? And some kids did. It was great. So blogging is a wonderful way for gifted kids to have an outlet for their thinking and their feelings and their emotions, sharing with other kids. So your teaching focus should be, too often gifted kids' facility for assimilating information is taken as a sign that gifted education should consist of filling up their brains, as I talked about, with vast quantities of information. On the contrary, information acquisition should take a diminished role in gifted education and information processing a great one. So you want to work towards helping kids process information, not acquire more of it. And no, we've already talked about that. I don't know why that's there. Oh, because I'm going backwards, that's why. So a final thought. We stand at the dawn of a new era. Before us is the most important decade in the history of civilization, a period of stunning technological innovation, unprecedented economic opportunity, and great cultural rebirth. The issue is, how do we prepare our children for it?
And that was in 2000.
And that was Nesbitt Megatrends in 2000. Yeah. So imagine where we are now, another 13 years later. Here are some suggested books if you're interested in intensity. I have a friend who is the most ultimately intense person I have ever known in my entire life. She drives me absolutely nuts, but she has Living with Intensity on her bedside to refer to daily to keep her grounded. She's not grounded, but she thinks it helps. But it's by Susan Daniels, who is a psychologist in Northern California, working with Dr. Dan Peters, if you've ever heard of Dan, and she wrote that. It's got some other people's writings in it too, but it explains all this overexcitabilities and the intensities and stuff. It's a good read. Emotional Intensity is another excellent book by Christine Fonseca, and she's a very interesting person because she writes about giftedness and emotional intensity, but she also writes novels, mystery novels. So she's got these two sides to her that's very interesting. I've never read one of her books, but I recently learned. And all of these people have spoken at the CAG conference before, so they're good friends of ours. Jim Webb, who I mentioned earlier, wrote Misdiagnosis, and that's a great one for parents who have kids who have been misdiagnosed. And then Jim Delisle, who was the president of the National Association for Gifted Children, wrote a book called Once Upon a Mind, which is also about intensity. So these are 4 good books. One parent suggested to Linda that I bring copies of books that parents could buy, but the problem with that is 2 things. One, I have to buy them with our money and then store them if I don't sell them, if people aren't interested in them, deal with the money and all that. And so many people read on their Kindles now, and I read on my Kindle app on my phone. So they're easily accessible by wireless now. Emotional Intensity I bought the other day for $9.99 on the Kindle, and it's like a $25 book. So they're easy to obtain. So I didn't do that.
That's great. But you got your suggested books here.
Yes, and I'm finished. This is my website. If you're interested in this as a PowerPoint, I'm going to put it up, but you have the paper. So, any questions? Tried to keep it to an hour. Yes, sir.
Hi, Barb. Thanks for coming. I'm Peter Town, principal of Green Hill School, and I had a question about the teaching focus slide, back 3 slides.
Okay.
And the bottom bullet there, which to me seems to be a little bit of reflection of the way we used to teach as opposed to where we're going with Common Core.
Terrific.
I may have oversimplified that, but
no,
the question
great
is,
connection.
The question is, do you see that the Common Core is going to better fit kids of gifted abilities as we move forward?
Definitely, definitely, and it's something that CAG has embraced, and we have a document that's out now that connects Common Core with gifted kids. It's on our website, and it's also on CDE's website because they have adopted it as a document that they want to promote. So yes, definitely, and I think you've looked at it, haven't you, Linda?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we saw it as an opportunity when it first came out, and there's so much negative press about it, which is really interesting to me. I heard this morning that the state of Indiana, which has an excellent education system and an excellent government system, and they're in the black and money and everything, they just unadopted Common Core because there's so many misperceptions about how it's going to track your kid into this kind of thinking. And if you look back at our standards previous, that was a whole nother direction of slotting our kids into just gaining facts and doing that kind of thing. So it's an interesting dilemma that's come up, but yes, we definitely see Common Core as, but not just for gifted kids, but for all kids. I mean, this thinking process thing is critical for gifted kids, but really it's critical for everybody. And you can certainly bring kids a lot further than we used to in terms of this thinking about like a disciplinarian conceptually can open so many doors to how do you think, how do you process information as opposed to just gaining more and more facts that you can't possibly do anything with unless you do something with them.
Yeah, at the math curriculum committee yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about, anybody there? Yeah. There was a lot of discussion, especially at the TK to 2 level, about the difference in wait time, helping kids to kind of suffer through a little bit of it, and teachers really feeling that uncomfortable, not really knowing, not presenting, and having some time. You want to paraphrase a little of that?
No, yeah. Just I didn't notice that as much with the kindergarten, but I think that was maybe the first and second kind of talked about that.
And so in allowing kids not giving wait time for kids to process.
Yeah.
The teachers feeling uncomfortable because there's a space there.
Yeah. But that's what we need to teach ourselves to do. Right. Allow that uncomfortable pause. And so we're going to talk to our trainers. We turned that into, okay, what do we do about that? Well, when we have our presentations at the beginning of the year, assuming the board approves our recommendation in June, we'll have our presentations and the training at the beginning of next school year. That'll be an area that we'll have to talk about, well, how do you do that? You know, how do you get better at that? And you were talking about giving kids time to think, time to process. Well, that quick moving
But
classroom.
I think in math is what we were talking about too.
That's
Like
right.
it seems more natural to do it in language arts and social studies
But
and
I
science.
think
just,
math is
but with
just as
math-
reflective. I mean, you
Yeah.
you still have to think about how you process numbers and get to a result or deal with an algorithm or whatever. One of the things that I used to do in terms of that, because I provided a lot of wait time, and I find this even with teaching adults, teaching my classes that I teach in gifted education, that lots of people don't like to speak up when they're just asked to think by themselves. So you can quickly say, share with your neighbor, pair share for 1 minute, now come back. Now, what did your neighbor say? What did she talk about? You know, rather than what you talk about. So then you've given time to think a little and then just share with one other person, you don't have to talk to the whole class, and then your information can be shared out and be validated by the other person rather than you having to do it. So those kinds of little techniques, and I mean, I was a math person, so I loved giving time to think in math. And the other thing that I did a lot of that I think was really helpful for my kids was to allow them to come up to the front and show how they solved the problem. At that time, you know, there was the overhead, but to share how they solved the problem and then go back and sit down and then have somebody else come up and share the exact same thing, but now they're sharing, they're thinking about how did I solve it, not listening to how Billy solved it. And I did a lot of my kids coming up in the front. It might be the same problem for an hour, but everybody got lots of learning about how to present in front of, my kids could present to anybody. And then they used to go to middle school, and the middle school teachers would say to me, your kids ask so many questions, and they always want to be up in the front of the room. Yes. But they gained so much because it's different hearing what somebody else says about how they solved it than you sharing how you solved it. And there might even be a different way of solving it. So somebody might have a different way. And that's an openness in mathematics that we don't always allow, particularly when teachers aren't comfortable with math. They don't really know what's the kind of the next level above what I'm teaching. Like, what does it really mean to divide by a fraction? What does that really mean? Think about that. Do you know? Do you really know what 1/2 divided by 1/3 means? You know how to invert and multiply, but do you really know what it means? So
That's the big deal. That's
a
what
big
we got to
deal.
do.
That's right. Anybody want to share what it means?
Can we talk about it?
We can talk about it, all that math
You want to
talk.
tell me?
Sorry, I have a question. There's a lot of these intensities in all kids throughout the entire spectrum of
Right.
special ed and
Right.
gifted, and so you see these intensities throughout autistic children and just your average children too. So my question is, when did these intensities become, and for lack of a misbehavior, for lack of a better term, a misbehavior, so that maybe it's for attention, or maybe it's how do you not discipline or consequence that? It's an intensity, but it's become a misbehavior.
Right. Yeah, and that's why it's important to talk to kids about, not only about giftedness, but about their intensities and their emotions and their feelings, to help them understand that when yes, that's who you are, but whenever you throw yourself on the ground and make it into a tantrum, then that disrupts everybody else and worries me as a teacher that you're hurting yourself, or that kind of thing. So there has to be a lot of discussion about how you deal with that. If you're going to feel like you're going to throw yourself on the ground, then what are some other things that you could do? And one of the things that I'm sharing with parents tonight is to actually sit down with the child and make a list, create a list of alternatives for that particular behavior.
Because you hear in discussions with parents, you hear that they are that way because they're so smart. And it's like, well, no.
Becomes an excuse for the
It becomes
parents,
an
too.
excuse for the parents for that temper
Right.
tantrum on the ground, and you're like, well, no, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's who they are, but there are still appropriate ways and places to express those things. So what's an alternative to throwing yourself on the ground? Because the intensity and the emotion is there, but do you have to throw yourself on the ground? Can you have another behavior can you go in and blog it, you know, on your computer when you feel like that and say it to somebody else? Can you go talk to your teddy bear? What are some things that you could do? And so make a list, and then when you're thinking about, it's just like dieting, you know, when you want to go to the fridge or you want to go to the cupboard and grab the chips, don't they always say, think about some alternatives, listen to some nice music, go take a walk in your neighborhood, you know, do something that distracts you from wanting those chips, and then it's supposed to go away. It never does. And come home and eat the chips. But at least you can say, I walked a little bit.
Yeah, right.
But, you know, it's that same kind of thing. It's just learning. It's like learning coping skills with any things that are difficult to do. And just because kids are smart doesn't give them the right to be obnoxious.
Right, and then sometimes I see that excuse of, well, it's just the way they are, and but it's not okay.
No, it's not okay. It's not okay. It's not okay to not be socially acceptable. It's just like Asperger's kids having to learn how not to be in people's faces when they talk. They can't do it, and yes, it's who they are, but it's still inappropriate.
Right, and I think that's when some gay parents have that
Misunderstanding,
misunderstanding and a tendency to go
Right.
there. It's like, but it's not okay.
No, it's not okay. It's not
Maybe we
okay.
can hit that a little bit
Yeah,
tonight.
it's just
also
like
with parents.
this guy that Clippers guy
yeah.
that just made the
True.
racial remarks.
Yeah.
Yes, he has a right to free speech, but was it appropriate for an NBA owner to do that? And they've kicked him out. They're telling him he's got to sell the team or he's gone.
Self-decided.
Stern already
Yeah.
decided, yeah. Good question. I don't know if I answered it, but
No, go ahead.
go ahead.
I came to your speech last time.
Presentation.
Presentation, thank you. And I can't remember if it was you or if we talked about it at a staff development day or something, but the recommendation really is to identify kids younger than what we're identifying. Is that kind of fun?
Yeah, we have been talking about that in the GATE Advisory Committee, and there is a lot of conjecture about when, but probably the GATE Advisory Committee may consider at the end of second grade identification, but it has not been a hot topic for our GATE Advisory Committee. I don't know about going any further down than at the end of second grade. What do you think, Barbara?
The important thing is to help kindergarten, first and second grade teachers recognize giftedness and be able to, you don't have to go through a process before you can serve the child who has, if a kindergartner's already reading, you don't make them do ah, ba, 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 you know, that kind of thing. But you can't believe the number of parents who call my office from all over the state every day and say, my kid's doing that and he reads chapter books. What do I do? So the important thing, I think, rather than trying to officially identify earlier, is to help your teachers recognize earlier and be able to serve those kids informally within their classroom, even if they decide to cluster them. I mean, clustering is just a way of putting kids together, and you don't have to label them to cluster them.
Right.
You do it as a teacher. You bring this group up because they need, you know, whatever it is that they didn't get. So it's the same thing.
One of the things that you'll notice when we unveil our LCAP is that in the GATE Advisory Committee discussions, there has been an interest in some level of support for the teachers on each of the sites, TK to 8. And so there is a concept about creating a cadre of GATE coaches. We'll just call them GATE coaches just for the word, and that's what's in the LCAP plan. And so this would be a full-time teacher on each one of the sites who would have an interest in creating this opportunity for teachers to count on that person to talk more about differentiation, TK to 3 even identification, preliminary identification, another colleague who would have a higher level of training. We would invest in the training, the professional development, not just on differentiation strategies and working with advanced or GATE students, but also in coaching. How do you become a critical friend and a coach? It's not somebody that's evaluating.
To have these kinds of conversations about how do you deal with the children who, how far do you go? Helping people with that, gathering resources for them to learn further.
And if we did this, if we had this concept, then we'd have theoretically a cadre then of 7 teachers who would work together and actually have some additional release time to work together as a PLC team, bring those concepts back to each of the sites. So that's an idea that we're developing, and that's in the draft LCAP.
I have a question, kind of along the same lines, is that, do you happen to know, like, around what age? I mean, I see a lot of kids who do well. I teach 2nd grade. But it's because they've had a rich preschool environment. They've had great, exposure just through what their family does. And they're not really gifted. They're just good students.
Well enriched.
Yeah, and is there moving from 3rd to 2nd, I was going to say, I see it more, in 2nd grade where I'm kind of questioning, I'm not really sure this kid is gifted, but they sure are doing a good job. And then by 3rd, I would see kids kind of, I've kind of in my mind call it stalling out, that they,
leveling out.
Yes.
Catching up
So
with
so
other
it's not a figment.
other peers. No, not at all, not at all. And in fact, that's one of the dilemmas in the conversation about early identification. What if you do identify a kindergartner and then by 3rd grade they're just leveling out with their other peers? Then, how do you go tell grandma they're not gifted anymore? You can't do that.
Right.
So
And then
to err on the side of not doing that, we tend to identify in our districts later. But like in Sac City, we identified at the end of 1st grade. And I tested every child in the district because I had principals who told me they didn't have any of those kids if they were high poverty, low performing schools. So we did informal, and we also had schools that did informal identification, just in recognizing some of their kids who had potential. And we did find that in the schools where that was done early, then kids didn't regress to the mean of their school by 3rd grade if the potential was really there. But if they didn't get enriched or challenged, they regressed to the mean of their school, which might be the 30th percentile by 3rd grade. So,
and I would think that that's not quite as much of a concern as ours here, because I feel like that we have a very challenging curriculum.
Right, and you also have a clientele that you don't have as many concerns about in terms of poverty and not having. I mean, all the kids. The interesting thing to me is always to look at how many kids live in 2-parent families, and all of your kids who've applied to be in the summer program, there's 2 parents. They might have 2 different last names because that's what they choose to do, but both names are both on there. So they're obviously, and there's only one address, so you obviously have lots of 2-parent families, which is huge, huge. Because you go into Sac City or Del Paso or someplace like that, into the inner city, Meadowview and those areas, and there's nothing but single women raising kids and on welfare, and that's hugely different than your neighborhood. Yes?
I have a question, I guess, as GATE projects out to 6th, 7th, 8th grade, okay? There's the GATE programs. Then when kids go into high school, there's no more GATE.
Well,
So there
is and there isn't.
There's AP courses and those
there's AP and honors.
Types of things. So how, I guess if you're clustering, we have to be really careful with assimilating them back to the average population, because anybody can take those AP classes. And all of those projects, those kids
Right.
still have to work with those
Right.
kids that are not, were never labeled GATE, but they're very gifted or talented students. Like she said, they do very well. So I guess my question is, what with how high school goes back to not labeling kids and having kids, and anybody can take these classes, what's the benefit of having these GATE programs if in the end these same kids, maybe they were never identified GATE, but they got into Cal or they got into Stanford because they worked their heinies off and did a good job and they got all those grades. So what's the benefit of having these kids when they all have to go into a college system or a high school system?
Well, if you challenge early, then the likelihood is that they will continue to accept that challenge and learn their own opportunities to keep themselves challenged, so that you would hope by high school they would make choices that would do that. And I think if you talk to the high school people, you would find that most of the kids who are choosing honors in AP are not kids that are going to beat themselves to death if they can't do the work. There probably are going to be more high-end kids in those classes than, unless you have children who are in that situation that you have.
My own children, yeah. Well,
But even when you're clustering, you still have other kids in your class, so your kids are interacting with, they don't never interact with the other kids in your class.
Right, but I'm just wondering what's a benefit of identifying a third grader if the curriculum is challenging enough, not challenging enough, is challenging to them, and they are working with kids that are more challenged with the curriculum than they are. What's the benefit of that if in the end they're going to have to, they're going to be working with kids that were never identified, that still have that hard, maybe just that work ethic?
If every teacher could provide challenging opportunities and appropriate opportunities for every child at their greatest level, then we wouldn't need to identify. But we have too many mediocre teachers who don't necessarily know what know how to do it, and without us saying to them, these are gifted kids, they tend to not challenge. And then the kids lose out because they will regress to a mean of some kind or another and not learn how to be metacognitive and to process information and to challenge themselves. They'll just, kind of go along with everybody else. And of course at middle school it's particularly challenging because it's not cool to be gifted, because it's cool to be like everybody else who isn't gifted. So there's that, there's that concern too. In a perfect world, I would say we wouldn't need to identify kids and label them, but it's not a perfect world yet. Until we get these kids to help us make it a perfect world. It'll never be a perfect world. We know that. We'll never not have war or conflict or, that's just part of history and part of mankind. But I think we need to continue to help advocate for the opportunity for these kids. They're the ones that are going to, solve our world problems in the future, and without challenges to help them learn how to think and process and do, they don't learn it on their own. They have to be supported. I mean, there's the, the Oprahs and the people who overcome and make their way anyway, but they're few and far between. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's a moral dilemma.
Yeah.
There you go.
Anything else?
Just one more quick question. If, because I am second grade and I don't want to bore those kids who are, that can go on beyond, is it appropriate, yet I don't want them to miss any of the building foundation
Right.
for their education. Is it a benefit, not a benefit to, in a sense, test them out through formative and summative
Not a-
assessments and then free up that time so
Yes.
that they can work on?
That's what
Something
compacting
like that.
is. Give the unit test or whatever evaluation at the beginning. Find out what they already know and don't make them sit there through, repetition of something they already know when they could go on into something deeper or more challenging while the other kids are getting that extra instruction and they need. In something they don't know, they need direct instruction
Right.
with everybody else, but they don't need to practice it 50 times. That metabolism that's going on and that intensity also allows them to process information much quicker so that it doesn't take as much time to practice. I got it. I don't need 30 more long division problems. I got it. So what can I do instead that would be more challenging? And that's the hardest thing about teaching is, how do I do that?
And with the clustering, even at TK, well, we won't know for TK and K, but first, second, and third, before the identification happens, our principals are going to work closely to try to figure out if we have identified informally some of our students how to cluster.
So you're saying we are going to identify it first, second, and third?
Not formally, but if a first grade teacher, second grade teacher, third grade teacher, well, not third grade because we've formally identified, so kindergarten, first, second grade teachers know, wow, I've got these kind of exceptional kids that are doing some exceptionally different things, kind of fitting these profiles. Make sure that in working on putting together the class lists that we can cluster those students because it makes the job of the teacher then, as Barbara is saying, to bring together, if we're going to identify kids that have already reached these certain milestones and benchmarks, we can create opportunities for them within a classroom to have a group within a group, just like we're doing at the upper grades. But there we already know that the students are identified.
Well, and you can also provide opportunities for these kids to be getting together. Like my sister is a second grade teacher, and at her school, they level for a short period of language arts where she has all the GATE kids from their 2-3 school. So they have like 8 second grades. So she gets all the kids, the high-end kids, for 45 minutes a day for language arts where she can do more intense things, reading kinds of things with them, and then they go back to their regular classroom. So at least there is some opportunity for them, for the bright kids to be together for part of the day. So those are things that, and they don't identify till 3rd or 4th grade, so she doesn't even know anything about identification.
Sure.
So there are things like that that can be.
Well, you're doing that now in your win time, Stephanie, at Mighty. Andrea, you do, yeah. So in your PLC team meetings, is that when you kind of talk about who's going to take which groups?
Right, but the, it's not perfect because you have, in the highest group that we have for WIN, you still have that big
Of
range,
course.
which
Well, you
some
do even if you have a GATE
probably
class,
have,
believe me.
they're not even, they're not at the caliber of those highest kids in there. And so you're always,
Well, my sister thought she was going to get the smallest group, and it keeps growing because kids keep improving. She's got like 40 kids now for this, and somebody else has 15, but, it's just kind of the...
But that does, in a way then, it's not really a GATE group because it statistically isn't, if you're getting that many
No, but if they're kids
you're
that are
not-
capable of that
Right.
and can value, what's the word I'm trying to say, can benefit from that, then, often people have asked me in the past, what if a kid really isn't gifted and they go all the way through the GATE program, which we had in Sac City was full day, from 2nd to 6th grade. And I said, well, it hasn't hurt them. They've still benefited from those opportunities unless there's been stress or, physical, headaches or that kind of thing. that then we would evaluate them out and have them go back to the regular classroom. But you know, I had, at 6th grade, I probably had a third of my kids who were really, truly gifted. A third of them were high achievers, and probably a third of them were good average kids. But they had been, since 2nd grade, they'd been together with really good teachers and challenging curriculum, and they did fine. So, you know, it doesn't hurt anybody.
Are headaches common? I was just thinking about.
Are headaches common?
And GATE children, or
More,
not necessarily?
ulcers and headaches are more common among gifted kids because of the intensities and the high stress that they put on themselves. You can't stress them, they do it themselves. So there's probably more. And interestingly too, the girls tend to mature earlier, which God knows why, if that has to do with brain function and
Or willing it to happen or something.
I don't know, but it's interesting, yeah. Boys don't, but girls do. No offense. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for coming. I'm glad we
Thank
got
you very
it.
much